just a few years later, that party, a governing party, went from 155 seats in our parliament to 2 seats. The new framework, I think, is more a vertical one of the bottom-up populist movements of people that believe that government ought to be in the hands of the many rather than in the hands of the few. Prepare people for that. And there's going to be some disruption, but you want change? Or do you really want change? Okay, we will give you change. But this is what it's going to be like. He had accomplished a most unusual thing. He had managed to raise the IQ of both sides of the House. You have to think about that one a little bit.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. Now, I want you to think about a party, a populist party on the right of politics, a party that is cannibalizing the support of a mainstream traditional Conservative party. And I want you to imagine that party is called Reform. Now, I'm not actually talking about Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party. In fact, there is a party, or there was a party, called the Reform Party of Canada, and I am delighted to be joined by its founder, Preston Manning. Preston, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Fraser.
It's a real honour to talk to you, not least because of the impact you've had on Canadian politics, but I know that your story and the story of Reform has had a direct influence on our own Nigel Farage and our own Reform Party, which people may not know. Many people out there may not be aware of. I wondered if we could start from the beginning. Your party, the Reform Party of Canada, was a Western Canadian party. What were the kind of issues that people were concerned about that weren't being picked up in the mainstream that made you think what we need is a new party?
Well, Reform was a populist party, and populist parties are first and foremost usually a reaction to an unacceptable status quo. And in Canada, this would be in the 1980s, there was increasing dissatisfaction with both the traditional parties, partly on fiscal grounds. We had governments that were running deficits and piling up debt, and had no plan for balancing the budget. Canada is a country of regions, the Atlantic region, the Central region, the Western region, and there was a distinct feeling in the West that the Western interests, particularly in the energy sector, were not being dealt with fairly. So that's what produced, and Western Canada has had a tradition of creating populist parties that actually got into government at the provincial level. So the idea of a third party was not a novel idea, and we ended up taking advantage of that. The two parties at that time were the Liberal Party and the old Progressive Conservative Party, both of which had alienated Western Canadians in one way or another. And so we had this big conference on what should we do, and we had a bunch of options. Should we create a new and more powerful interest group? Could we work within one of the parties? We invited the Prime Minister at that time to send a representative to argue why we should work within, in his case, the Conservative Party. But and then a vote was taken, and the decision was made to create this new party, and I ended up by being the leader of it, probably by default, because nobody else wanted to do it.
Takes those kinds of people like you sometimes in politics to get things moving.
Important thing about this, Myers, it fits in a bit with your introduction. Often political scientists will ask, well, how come these bottom-up populist parties today, and there's literally dozens of them across the Western country, why are they essentially conservative or libertarian in right of center, to use the old terminology? And the simple answer is because the establishment and the elites in most of these parties is left of center, and so these things are a reaction to that, and that's partly what defines their ideological position.
And you mentioned that there might have been the opportunity, or it could have been a tactic to try and change or influence the existing Conservative Party at the time, the Progressive Conservative Party. They wanted nothing to do with you, it seems. Why was that? Was there ever a possibility of changing within the existing party system, or was it always a no-go?
Well, in this case, the Prime Minister at that time was Brian Mulroney, who was the leader of a progressive Conservative government. And when I wrote to Moroni and said, we're going to have this big conference and we're going to look at these options. Why don't you send your best person to argue why the Conservative Party could still be a vehicle? And I even suggested the name. His deputy prime minister was a man by the name of Don Mazankowski, who was highly respected in Western Canada. But Moroni said, no, I won't send them because you guys have already decided to create this party, which was not true. We didn't know what was going to happen at this conference. And he said, you've already decided. So not only will I not send anybody to argue that, I will forbid any of my members from having anything to do with it, which from their standpoint was unfortunate because a few years later, that party, a governing party, went from 155 seats in our parliament to 2 seats. It was the greatest electoral defeat of any political party in Canada at the federal level. But there was an opportunity to try to accommodate this populist uprising through that party, and he rejected it. Later on, like we ended up forming the official opposition after the 1997 election. But I was conscious that we had to do something different. By that time, we were getting a little bit stale. So I proposed this thing called a united alternative. That this was not a union of reform with the old Progressive Conservative Party, but it was a union of reform with 3 populist provincial parties in Canada. And we've got this united alternative together. I lost the leadership in the course of all this shuffling around, but Stephen Harper ended up being the head of that. Harper then negotiated a union between what was left of the old Progressive Conservative Party and this united alternative, which created the current Conservative Party of Canada, which ended up forming a government for 9 years. So it took a bunch of moves to get from a populist party as a protest party to a populist party in government.
And in your view, that kind of merger was necessary in order to make that transition, because I look at Reform UK and I think a lot of people in the party, understandably, see the Conservatives in the UK, the traditional Conservative Party, as their enemies, as their chief opponents in politics, mostly because of their distinct record in the last 14 years. But is that something that do you think it's necessary, perhaps even inevitable, that the right needs to unite in the UK or in other places?
Well, in our case, Reform, or this united alternative, was growing in strength to the point where it could literally take over what was left of the old Progressive Conservative Party. That might not be the case in the UK. But and one of the challenges, this may be more a Canadian characteristic. Like Canadians, if you want Canadians to move from A to C, you got to show them B. A to C is a little bit too much of a leap, but B, and in this case, A was Reform, C was a Reformed Conservative Party, and B was this united alternative. And that may not be applicable in the UK, but it was here. This sort of you had to go in stages.
One word you haven't shied away from using is the term populist. Usually this is thrown around as a term of abuse, as suggesting that either people who support such things might be far right, racist, unintelligent. Why do you think it's important to essentially embrace populism, or put yourself forward as a populist party?
That's a very good question, Fraser, because I think the political landscape is changing in the Western world, and for decades we've described our politics in terms of this left, right, center, left, right, center. And those terms come from the seating arrangements after the French Revolution, and I keep asking exactly why are we using that framework. But the new framework, I think, is more a vertical one of these bottom-up populist movements of people that believe that government ought to be in the hands of the many rather than in the hands of the few. De Tocqueville actually referred to the 1830s. It's saying that there's a dividing line in the political parties that's not what became this left, right, center being, but it's people that are animated by the aristocratic passion who do not want to see rank and file people having much to say with government, and people that are animated by a democratic passion which wants to see the public have a greater role in their public affairs. And it's this vertical dimension that I think is the dominant framework for looking at contemporary politics. And then that raises the question, okay, what the basic philosophical characteristic, if it's got one at all, of populism is democracy, grassroots democracy. But it can then be given flavors in one direction or another. It can be populism with libertarian and conservative characteristics, which I think is what Nigel Farage is building upon. But it can be populism with socialist characteristics, which I think you're having some instances of labor outliers linked up with environmental extremists trying to do the same thing. So I think what's helpful to people to understand the current political situation in many of our countries is there this vertical dimension now to our politics, and it can be given left of center or right of center characteristics depending on its leadership and what these people that are involved in it want.
And if you were Nigel Farage, or if you were in Canadian politics today, how do you hold that group of people together? Because, as you say, there are a lot of people who do want bottom up change, might have very different ideas about, particularly how to manage the economy. There will be a lot of people who have quite left wing ideas about the economy, but have cultural anxieties that are best expressed by a party like Reform. Or people might have very libertarian ideas about that. How do you manage to?
Well, that's a huge question too. But there's about three things I could say on that. One is that there has to be some guidelines that people agree to if they're going to be part of one of these parties. One of these, and I mentioned this to Nigel and his group I spoke to one of his conferences. It's to major on the majors. We were a new party, and we felt we had to have a position on everything in order to prove that we belonged in the big leagues with the other people. And we had a pamphlet called The 64 Reasons to Vote for Reform. And in retrospect, it might have been better to have 4 good reasons and get people to agree we can't go crusading on everything as much as we might personally want to do that. Let's agree on the 4 or 5 things. The second thing is to air our internal differences privately, not publicly. A party like Reform UK or Reform Party of Canada is getting together people with very strong opinions who have never worked together before. So you're bound to have differences, but let's agree not to go airing them publicly. And then perhaps the most important thing, because this gets into suppose a populist party with all these characteristics actually gets into government. I think one of the first things it should do is address the confidence convention in the House of Commons, and that government should get up, and the leader should get up and say in the very first day, this government will not resign unless it loses an explicit vote of no confidence. It will not resign because we lose a vote on a section of a bill. We won't even resign if we lose a vote on a bill. Well, then ask the House, did you just mean to defeat the bill, or did you actually want to throw at the government? So the confidence measure, and then give more free votes to your members, particularly on these moral and ethical issues that are so divisive, like medical assistance in dying, for example. Give freedom of more freedom of conscience to ordinary members, freedom to represent their constituents' interests or their own personal views. But at the end of the day, if that means something going against the government, you don't resign. You say, okay, did you just mean to defeat us on that, or did you mean to defeat the government? I think that's one way of managing this diversity of strong opinions when you get into the House of Commons, and particularly if you're a government. So those would be 3 guidelines that I think would have been helpful, or would be helpful in the case of Reform UK.
I get a sense in Britain, people are very thirsty for change. People want to see government change things quite radically, quite quickly. But at the same time, it's possible, you as the Reform Party of Canada, were not winning elections, in the first instances, or not winning anything like enough to form a government or to become the opposition, you can sometimes be mistreated in the media and mischaracterized, and there's a lot of flack that you'll get. How do you get people to keep the faith? How do you get people to see that this might be a longer term project than perhaps we're used to in an age where politics is decided on Twitter?
Keep working at it. Like in our country, because it's such a huge country, this building constituency organizations that could nominate competent candidates is just a huge job. 5,000 miles between Vancouver Island on the west and tip of Newfoundland on the east. So it took us 4 years just to build the constituency organizations, the grassroots capability of nominating competent candidates. And I don't know if there's any short route to that. There may be, like in Britain, you don't have the distances and the size. We started to get provincial allies. It seems to be in the UK, it works almost the other way. You get allies at the municipal level. But I don't know if there's any substitution for just working hard at it and trying to get there. If you do get to government, I think one lesson, I'm not sure if this comes from a populist background or just looking at things generally. If a reform group actually gets into government after there's been long periods of government by the traditional parties or uncertainty, like in your case, whether it's been, 6, 7 prime ministers in 7 years, what that basically means is the civil servants are running the country.
Yeah.
And so if you get a government in there that wants to do something different, it, I think, has to be disruptive. I think it has to be prepared for people. We're going to be disruptive because you don't like the way the current system's working, and we're going to have to disrupt that system in order to change it. And I think preparing people for that, I think that was one of the lessons Trump learned from his first term.
Yeah.
And the Canadians particularly, our inclination is do things incrementally, even if we want change, but we're going to go step by step. I think you don't have the time to do that. If you form a reform-oriented government, you got to be disruptive to start with, and then start to put the pieces back together again, and prepare people for that. And there's going to be some disruption, but you want change, or do you really want change? Okay, we will give you change, but this is what it's going to be like.
I wanted to ask you about a specific policy area, which is energy. And of course, that was a big factor in the alienation of Western Canadians, but it's become a huge live issue in the UK as well, particularly as a result of net zero policies. I was struck by the amount of people when I attended the Reform UK conference, how many people cheered when Nigel Farage said drill baby drill, when we're often told by our media that this is a niche issue no one cares about. Why do you think this issue is so central to our politics? It's certainly central to Trump as well. He came up with that phrase. Why has this become such a core issue?
Well, I think people are realizing how vitally important energy resources are to the performance of your economy. And if your economy is underperforming, could it be that we've not got it right with respect to our energy sources? And of course, I come from Western Canada, which is the oil and gas producing, Alberta particularly, oil and gas producing period. And the federal government, particularly under the Trudeau administration in Canada, it treated the resource sectors, including energy, but agriculture, forestry, mining, and the fisheries, as relics from the past or environmental liabilities. It imposed caps on oil and gas production. It increased the taxation of that sector to the point where capital is leaving Canada and going to the United States and going elsewhere. So I think you have to get it right on the energy issue. And what we argued for is balance. We didn't argue that you're going to just drill oil and gas wells in your backyard and who cares what the consequence. Nobody argued that. We said we wanted balance. We wanted economic impact assessments of environmental protection regulations. In Canada, the bias was all the other way. You had environmental impact assessments on every economic activity, but no economic impact assessment on those regulations. And we said if you did that, politicians could find the balance between environmental protection and resource development. And of course, this current crisis in the Middle East that has just highlighted this absolute. The world is using over 1 million barrels of oil a day. There's things you can do to make that barrel of oil as environmentally and socially responsible as possible. And Canada argues we're doing that, that our oil from that standpoint is preferable to oil coming from the Middle East or from Venezuela or from Nigeria. But striking that balance, and I think in your case, where there's been such an emphasis on everything but oil and gas development, capping of North Sea production and so forth, there's a need for a restoration of that balanced approach to energy and environment.
And in Canada, the Liberals recently won quite a convincing election victory with Mark Carney. How are people on your side of politics feeling about that? Are they despairing? Are they hopeful that things can be turned around?
Well, two things. First of all, his majority was quite shaky. He didn't win a majority in the election, but he managed to persuade several members to cross the floor to give him a majority. If I'd been in the House, that would have reminded me of that. I think it's one of the greatest quips that Churchill ever gave when one of his members crossed the floor and he got up and congratulated the guy, I forget who it was, saying he had accomplished a most unusual thing. He had managed to raise the IQ of both sides of the House. You have to think about that one a little bit. I think that might have applied to some of these floor crossers here, but Carney does have a slim majority. He talks now about being a little more receptive to the development of oil and gas. He removed these caps on oil and gas production. He didn't repeal the statute that authorizes the government to do that. He just reversed the regulations under it. So he's still got the statutory power to do it again next month if he thought he should. So there's a lot of skepticism about how sincere this turnaround has been. And one of the sad things is that under the Liberal government in Canada, the restrictions and the regulations and the conditions for oil and gas development are such that a lot of that capital just going to the United States, billions of dollars of capital going to the United States. And why should we operate in a jurisdiction where there's that degree of uncertainty? The other thing, Mr. Carney wrote a book, and it's a great big long book, 540 pages. I read it the first time it came out, but then I read it again when it looked like he was going to be prime minister. And it makes it absolutely clear he believes that the government and the public sector is the primary driver of the economy and ought to. He refers to free enterprises as market fundamentalists, refers to them quite negatively. And he is committed to net zero on every second chapter. So I think there's a lot of skepticism, particularly in Western Canada, that this government's going to be, he's smarter than the previous prime minister, who was not exactly a genius. But being smarter going in the wrong direction is more dangerous than an idiot going in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. And Canada is sometimes seen by many around the world as the woke capital of the world, especially in comparison to the Trump-run United States. Is that a fair characterization? Is that something that Canadians experience?
Well, it's been a characteristic of our elites, of our political elites, and of our central Canadian media, the Toronto-based media. That's where our legacy media are based, and virtually all of them are infected with woke virus and DEI virus, and now that's starting to change because the bloom is off that rose in certain parts of the country and certain segments of the population. But that is still very much a flavor of our elites, and whether Canada can make it's going to take Canada time to make changes in that direction.
And finally, I just wanted to return to the theme of populism. It's often talked about as the populist moment or the populist wave. But do you think it might actually be something more durable rather than a passing fad? Is this a longer term reorientation of politics?
Well, the critics, like if you go in the academic literature on populism, it's 90% opposed to it, but partly because these are academic elites, and populism is not particularly in favor of the elites. So, but I think populism is properly understood is something far more fundamental than just a current wave. It's a assertion of one of the basic premises of democracy. That and Pericles, the old Greeks got into this. This is not a new argument. You had Plato quoting Socrates that they preferred the government by the few, if the few were ethically responsible and accountable for their actions. But Pericles said, with respect to Athens later on, we are government by the many and not by the few. And I think if that is a fundamental premise behind this populist uprising, this is not then something superficial or a fad that's passing away. People have to decide, do you prefer government by the many? It has to be properly structured and ethical too. Or do you prefer it by the few, than the few that you've had? And that question and the answer to that question is something far more fundamental. It puts populism in a different light than, oh, this is just a fad that'll pass away in 5 or 6 years.
Preston Manning, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.